Hello everyone and welcome back to another video on the channel. Today we're going to be kicking off our 13 days of Halloween series, which I do every single year with The Exorcist Believer. Yet another horror sequel that everybody was asking for. This movie comes from David Gordon Green, who of course did the Halloween trilogy as of recently with Blumhouse, and this very much does feel like a Blumhouse Exorcist movie, which is to say that it was just okay. And as per usual, this will be a spoiler review for The Exorcist Believer, so if you have not seen this film yet, it is now releasing in theaters, and if you want to go check it out, and then come back here to see all my spoilery thoughts on this film. So what is The Exorcist Believer about? So essentially it follows two families this time around instead of the one family that was in the first film, where both the daughters of these families kind of go off into the woods and they disappear for 3 days total before they come back possessed by some evil spirits. The main family in this film, kind of taking the role of the MacNeils from the first film, is led by Leslie Odom Jr., who is fantastic in this movie. I actually do think that all the performances in this movie are pretty solid. I do like the parents of both of the families and their dynamics, especially in the first half of this movie, because it feels more like prisoners than anything else, which I do think is an interesting direction. I will have a video kind of breaking down the original Exorcist trilogy by the ending of the weekend, because I just watched all 3 of those films, and they're all 3 vastly different films. But even Exorcist 3, I think in particular, is more like a Zodiac or a Seven David Fincher type of movie than it is an Exorcist film. And so this movie starts off in a way that's more prisoners than an Exorcist film. And so I do think that this franchise kind of has a history and a past of kind of taking different genres or taking different types of storylines that you'd see in other type of movies and kind of having that to lead into the sort of Exorcist type of thing, which is exactly what this movie is trying to do. And although it doesn't have that same intensity and visceral, I guess, feeling and performances from these parents that Prisoners may have had, which is one of the greatest films of all time, this movie does kind of capture a really nice tone and eerie feeling for the first half of this movie, for like, I think it's like 45 minutes until the kids finally do return in this film, because the movie does take a while to set up these characters and to see these two families that have never really met each other. Their daughters were friends. They didn't really know that their daughters knew each other, but now both of these families are being kind of thrust together in this terrifying situation that no parent wants to be in. And, you know, there is some conflict there between these family members I do think was explored a decent amount for this first half that I wish kind of bled into the back half of the movie just a little bit more. But getting back to Leslie Odom Jr.'s character in particular, who I think him and his daughter are definitely the heart of this movie and are really the only characters in this film that I really did connect to in any sort of way. And I think that's mainly because this, you know, the opening scene of this movie is in Haiti between Leslie Odom Jr.'s character and his wife, who are there before the daughter is born. She is pregnant with this baby, and this earthquake happens, and it is absolutely devastating. And Leslie Odom Jr.'s character is put in this situation where he has to decide whether to save his unborn child or his wife, which is an absolutely devastating decision to make. And of course, he does decide to save his daughter, and so he is a single parent essentially, in the same way that Chris MacNeil was a single mother in the original Exorcist movie. And this dynamic between these characters, where he doesn't really share these things with his daughter about his wife because there is some sort of pain between this sort of relationship, and the father-daughter relationship is sweet still. You know, it is something that is on the surface a good relationship, but there's something deep down that feels that there's a gap missing between them because of that lack of communication between the father and the daughter about the mother. The entire events of this movie is because the daughter feels so disconnected that she wants to go out into the woods with her friend and perform this ritual essentially to try to communicate with her mother, because she never got to meet her mother, and her father doesn't like talking about her. Her father won't let her take this scarf that was hers, and she just feels so disconnected from this sort of part of her life, this part of herself, because she is the combination of both of these people, and she feels like half of that is missing. And so all that sort of storyline is there and is set up pretty well in the first half of the movie. And when she does go missing, the reaction from these parents, like I said, from both ends are pretty interesting. And I do think that the other parents are also interesting, because it is an Exorcist movie. This movie is going to have a religious undertones, or really overtones, throughout the entire film. And the other family is a couple who are very much religious. They are a part of a church, and they immediately start to blame the devil. Like, once something bad happens, it's the devil that caused these sort of things. And I do think that is an interesting sort of dynamic between, you know, Leslie Odom Jr.'s character, who is very much more skeptical of everything that is going on, versus them that are very much dead set on this being the cause of all their pains. And so once the kids finally do return after 3 days, and they're kind of just found in this barn, and they're acting really weird and different, it does have a very unsettling tone at this initial change. But if I'm being completely honest, I really had no problems with this movie for the first half of the film. It was kind of slow, and it wasn't really an Exorcist movie quite yet. And the movie does kind of have like an identity crisis of the first half of the movie feels completely different from the second half of the movie, because once you get to this point and you get the turn of these girls and they start acting really weird, and of course you get that scene that you saw in the trailer with one of the daughters in the church saying the body and the blood in a very creepy and disturbing manner. And once you get into that sort of thing, the movie tries to just rush into this Exorcist type movie, and all those great beats that were in the original Exorcist film and how those characters, were so desperate and were kind of on their last attempts at trying to save her daughter, where, she tried to go to all the doctors, she tried to go to all these psychiatrists and try to figure out what was wrong with her daughter until she just couldn't fall into anything else besides, going to a priest to perform an exorcism. There was a sense of desperation with that fact, whereas this movie, like I said, the other parents are already kind of dead set on them being possessed, and they're just kind of immediately assuming that that's the case. But everybody else in this film surrounding these characters also are just kind of jumping onto the fact that they are just possessed and they need to perform an exorcism, making everything in the back half of the film just extremely rushed. One of the best things about that original Exorcist film was Father Karras, which I'll get into a lot of his character in my video breaking down The Exorcist and The Exorcist 2 and The Exorcist 3 later on this week. But when it comes to his character, he was a priest that was kind of losing his faith because he started practicing psychology on behalf of the church, and they're like, oh, we don't need to perform these exorcisms anymore. We understand what mental health is and how, mental illnesses can affect a person, and that they're not possessed by the devil, but there's actual scientific and medical ways to help these people. And so exorcisms became very much rare and very much like they're not going to perform these things, and if it ever does happen, it is a very, very rare and dangerous case, making an exorcism feel like almost above everything else. It feels heightened, it feels even scarier because it feels so rare. And so you have all these characters like Dowd's character, who is also very dead set that this is some sort of religious thing that is happening to these kids, or you have the priest in this movie who pretty much immediately after seeing what is going on with the kids immediately goes to the church and says, oh, I need to be approved for an exorcism. And, everybody immediately is like, oh, yes, this is what needs to happen. Even our main character with Leslie Odom Jr., who, like I said, his setup at the beginning of the movie is very purposeful. It's very, I guess, direct in it showing that, his wife had this spiritual side to her that he didn't really believe in. And once all this tragic stuff happened, when she said that, oh, all this spiritual stuff is going to protect our daughter at any cost, and then this tragedy happened where she ended up dying, it just kind of broke that, I guess, spiritual side of this character so much where he's not going to believe in any of those sort of things. And so when he's confronted with this idea that it could be religious, he pushes back at it at first, but he's very easily convinced by Dowd's character to kind of investigate these things that have to do with Chris MacNeil's character, which is why you get Ellen Burstyn back in this film as that character from the first film. And she very much convinces Leslie Odom Jr. that you need to do these sort of things. You need to perform an exorcism, whether it's through one religion or spiritualism or any other thing in general. It just needs to be performed in that sort of way. And he just kind of gets on board very quickly. And there's like a weird Avengers Assemble type of storyline where you're taking all these people from different backgrounds, one that's spiritual, one that's from the Catholic Church, and the parents who are from a different church, and they all kind of come together to try to perform this exorcism in different ways that are kind of following the different backgrounds of all these characters. And I do think that is a good idea to have an exorcist movie that isn't fully based in the Catholic Church and to bring in different religions. But this feels very much not earned because there's so many characters in this film where you don't really feel connected to any of them because the film just feels so spread out. Most of these characters that are going to be performing the exorcism are not introduced until like a little bit over an hour into the film. And so this main priest that is in this movie that is a part of the Catholic Church, he just is kind of there, and then he dies because the series has a very much, strong intent on killing every single priest that comes on screen in any sort of way. In this film, you get a very brutal death with this character, which is kind of hinted at in the original Exorcist with, the film director having his neck twisted backwards and thrown out of the window. And that essentially happens to him in this movie. It's just this time you get to see it happen, which I do think it is kind of cool to see that happen. I do think it's scary just to have the idea of that happening. You don't actually get to see the body, yet everybody seems so, I guess, disturbed and traumatized from seeing what happened to this guy in that original Exorcist film, which I do think that's, less is more in that case. But seeing it in this movie after all these years, sure, I'll accept that. There needs to be some brutal scenes in this Exorcist movie, but I didn't care about this priest whatsoever because he was extremely extremely one note. He didn't have any conflict of faith whatsoever. That's just made him a very one note character. There was also the pastor of the couple's church, who was also there to help perform the exorcism, which honestly I couldn't tell you one thing about this guy besides him being the pastor at this church. There were also the parents that had this religious belief, and again, their performances in the first half and that conflict that was introduced between Leslie Odom Jr. and these parents was interesting at first, especially in the scene where the kids first go missing. They're in that police station. They kind of have this judgmental way of trying to, blame each other for what has happened to each other's kids, and I do think there was some conflict there, but once you get into this point in the movie, they're just all together and they're all kind of working together to try to, save their children, and that conflict just kind of disappears at that point. So I don't really care about these parents. And then of course there is the woman who is kind of the more spiritual side of things, who is in this movie that is more connected to Leslie Odom Jr.'s character, and she was also just kind of one note as well. I honestly didn't really know anything about her, and I'll get into the exorcism at the end of the movie, particularly, with her character and how that was such a missed opportunity, but I'll get into that in a second. But besides that, her character was just extremely one note. But then there's Ellen Bernstein's character, who returns into this franchise after 50 years of being away from it, which, honestly, I don't know why she is in this movie whatsoever. I think there are so many characters in this film that this movie tries to explore, and to throw a subplot between Ellen Bernstein and how Reagan kind of left because she wrote this book, kind of putting out all their baggage and what happened in their past out into the world, and it isn't explored nearly enough to make that storyline interesting. Really, her only role is to have a big preachy exposition scene, basically saying that's, exorcisms and possessions are in every single religion, and how each religion kind of has a different way to explore those things, which kind of led to that Avengers Assemble type of moment. And she's really just there to push the main character into believing these sort of things instead of him going on a journey himself. And by the time that she goes and actually confronts one of these kids that is possessed and sees this demonic presence that she hasn't seen in 50 years, and this little demon child just stabs her in the eyes. And there are two moments in this film that did genuinely surprise me, and this was one of them. I do think it is pretty gutsy of this movie to try to maim a main character in a way that you were anticipating seeing her on screen, and then she's on screen finally. She has a couple scenes and then she just gets her eyes stabbed out, and you think that she dies in this moment, but no, she does survive. She just has no more eyes. She can't see. She just has like this bandages over her eyes for the rest of the movie, but that's really her only purpose, is to show up, exposit, and then get stabbed in the eyes, and then she's out of the movie for the rest of the film. And I don't know, that's just unfortunate. And of course, by the end of the movie, Reagan shows back up to her mother's side, and she can't see who walks in the room, of course, because she has no more eyes, but it is Reagan making a cameo at the ending of the film. I just didn't feel anything for that. I didn't need to have her come back to an Exorcist film, because I don't know, I just don't think an Exorcist movie in general needed a sequel. And I'll get into, Exorcist 2 and 3 and how different they were compared to that original Exorcist movie, which makes them work in different ways. But this film tries to be a retread of The Exorcist, which I don't think works whatsoever. And it just feels desperate to bring these characters back into the fold for no other reason than just, what she has in this role, which is a whole bunch of nothing. But let's get into what we all came to this movie for, which is the actual exorcism, the actual possessions, which I will say is actually pretty terrifying. I do think that the movie handles the way that these children are possessed, and the performances from these children, especially in the voices that they have, and the creepy, just the things that they do in general are just really disturbing and unsettling. And I do think that The Exorcist is one of the scariest movies of all time, to a point where I did not like it the first time I watched it, because I was so deeply unsettled and disturbed that I just never cared to watch it again until just this past weekend when I watched it for the second time ever. And so the way that the possessions are, I guess, portrayed in these films are really effective. And I do think that this movie, if you're going into this film just for these scare sequences, just for a creepy possession, just for what you got out of the trailer, from the back half of that trailer, which I do think was even more effective than the movie itself, but you do get those creepy scenes. I do think that these kids are really terrifying in these roles, and the actual exorcism by the ending of the film does build up to a decent amount of intensity that I do think is going to work for general audiences. I was just let down because I didn't care about these characters all too much, and by the time you get these characters performing these different exorcisms, and the priest dies, and then the more spiritual woman starts doing her thing, and this is where the film almost entirely lost me. Like I said, there's a lot in that original Exorcist film where less is definitely more, and so this woman decides to do, her spiritual side of things. She starts performing this ritual on these kids, and they kind of jolt back, and they look straight up, and this mist starts coming out of their mouth, a CGI glowing yellow, like, mist thing that was like a spirit, and then she lights a fire and then puts it out, and smoke fills the room, and the CGI smoke comes in contact with this orange yellow glowing mist, and then it all dissipates. and it's like I didn't need any of those visuals. I think that the original Exorcist movie feels so grounded because it feels very heightened in terms of like, this never happens. This feels scary because an exorcism is so rare. A possession is so rare that's, you know, these characters don't really know how to handle this sort of thing. And you don't get to see a lot of sequences in that first Exorcist movie. You don't get to see Burke, you know, get his neck twisted and thrown out the window. You don't get to see Father Merrin die. You don't get to see all these things happen in the movie. It's just all kind of set in the background, and the characters just react to the horrifying things that they see. And so to see this mist and stuff in this film just kind of took me out of the movie because it stopped feeling real. And honestly, I do think it's just the simplest fix in the world. Like I said, less is more. She could have done the exact same ritual in the exact same way that she did. Just take out the CGI mist and the CGI smoke and just have the kids jolt up and have them like viscerally reacting to whatever she's doing in a way that feels like something is definitely happening. And she lights out that fire and smoke fills the room, and then it all dissipates and the characters react to, you know, the kids being a little bit different now. They're kind of acting like their old selves for just a split second before they kind of snap back into that possession. And I do think that would have been a lot more terrifying, because as soon as you have CGI smoke and mist swirling through the air, it just becomes like I'm watching a fake thing. It doesn't feel visceral or real anymore. It just doesn't feel real. But besides that, like I said, the possession itself and the exorcism itself does have some pretty intense moments. Like I said, the moments with Ellen Burstyn getting her eye stabbed out was a genuinely shocking movie. And the very end of this movie, with one of the two girls actually dying, succumbing to the possession and dying from her injuries by the ending of this film, is actually quite tragic. I do think that this movie, if I cared more about those parents, because it's the other couple, their kid who ends up dying by the ending of this film, if I cared a little bit more about that family and their dynamics and, you know, that loss just a little bit more, I do think I would have actually cared. But in any of this, instead of just feeling the shock at, oh, they actually did it. They actually killed one of these kids, one of the untouchable characters that you didn't think could be harmed, like Ellen Burstyn's character, like these two children. You didn't think they could be harmed. It's just the people around the exorcism that should be harmed in this situation. So for them to kill one of the kids in this movie, to have that moment where the other daughter is sitting in her school and she looks over to see an empty chair in her classroom, and just to kind of have that eerie feeling of loss by the ending of this film, I do think that is a gutsy decision. That's one of the two things in this movie that did surprise me. But again, I just didn't care because the characters were nothing more than just a one-note portrayal of, I guess, either a priest or a spiritualist, or, you know, a religious family and their daughter, or, you know, any sort of thing like that. The only storyline that I did care about was Leslie Odom Jr. and his daughter, and by the end of the film, him holding his daughter once she stops breathing and giving her that scarf and fulfilling that arc that they had set up by the very beginning of this movie between that father and daughter. I do think that that relationship works just enough for me to think that this movie was just okay by the end of it, despite being an overall disappointing experience. Because like I said, that first half was pretty good. It was pretty intriguing. It had a different tone and feel to it, and the atmosphere was pretty good. But by the time you got to that second half and how rushed everything felt, I just didn't care about any of these characters. If you just focus on maybe one different religious aspect, I do think that had a lot of potential to have an Exorcist movie from a different religious perspective, and that exorcism being performed by some other sort of ritual. That could have been a great idea to introduce into this franchise, but throwing them all together all at the same time with all these different characters just did not work for me. But those are going to be my thoughts on The Exorcist Believer. I'm very curious to hear your reactions to this movie, because like I said, for a general audience, I do think that the scares and the disturbing aspects and the visuals of this movie work just enough to maybe be entertaining for you. But if you wanted literally anything more than that, if you're a fan of the original Exorcist and the substance that that movie had, especially Exorcist 3, which I do think is highly underrated. Again, I'll be talking about the entire Exorcist trilogy, including The Exorcist 2, which is just, that's a whole other thing, which I cannot wait to talk about in that video. And so if you wanted something more like that had a little bit more substance to it, this movie was lacking pretty much all of that, while still having a very fun Blumhouse type of feel. So let me know in the comments down below what you thought of this movie. If you enjoyed this review and want to see more reviews from me, especially during this 13 days of Halloween series that I do every single year, I definitely want to talk about the new VHS movie that comes out pretty soon here. I think there's, Five Nights at Freddy's, and then a few other films that I will be talking about throughout the month of October. So if you want to see all that and more, definitely subscribe to the channel, leave a like on this video. Like I said, comment down below, and I hope to see you all in my next one.